this is something that Bush is not known for, and it's not in any of the other books that have been written. George Bush, in many ways, created, or his appointees created, the international humanitarian response system. And the reason Catherine Bertini is so important is she was the executive director of the World Food Program, which is now the largest UN agency. And many career people in the UN system will say that she was the greatest of all of the agency heads in the history of the UN. And in many ways, she created, helped, now she's a modest woman, so I don't want to, but she created the humanitarian response system, which has been highly effective. Bush actually shifted the focus of American foreign policy to people, to poor people who are being, who are at risk in these conflicts, because there was a massive increase in the number of collapsed states while he was president because of the end of the Cold War. And so we have a large number of chapters on the humanitarian side of the administration. He's seen as a sort of a hard realist, when in fact, there's this other aspect of his presidency that's not well known. And so we put those chapters in there. I think there are 4 or 5 chapters, a quarter of the book on that aspect of it, because it's not been covered in the other histories very well.
Catherine Bertini, thank you for being here. George H.W. Bush's humanitarian contributions are not as immediately recalled, but were, as Andrew Natsios was saying, really quite important, partially for the many things that didn't happen, the many bad things that could have happened. Could you discuss some of President George H.W. Bush's contributions on humanitarian leadership?
So on humanitarian, very specifically, several things happened during his administration. One was one in which Ambassador Pickering and his team were very much involved, because it was the creation ultimately of the Department of Humanitarian Affairs, which is now called OCHA, the Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs at the UN. Up until that time, there wasn't any formal coordination except for a very small office for disaster assistance. And so this, with strong support from the US government, became then the coordination mechanism for the UN. And it has a lasting impact, even up until this day, in many, many different ways. And just as the example of the congressional resolution regarding the Iraq War, there was a congressional resolution also calling for coordination within the UN around the same time. So there was a lot of interactive work done by the administration, on one hand with Washington, and on the other hand with New York. That was done, the coordination work and the resolution creating it was done just in time, because the South African drought hit in 1992, in Southern Africa drought, and I think 18 million people were impacted or potentially impacted by that drought. It didn't get a lot of press, in part because there was a lot of work that went into it, including the major donor being the United States of America, to not just to get food in, but to cut red tape in order to move food. For instance, apartheid was still the law of the land in South Africa. And while South Africa was not as impacted as some of the rest of the countries in the region, we needed to use the ports in South Africa in order to get food into landlocked countries. So there was a lot of coordination done with a lot of help from not just the UN, but the US, in order to facilitate the cross-border operations between South Africa and other countries, just as one example. Another example is Operation Restore Hope in Somalia, which, as you recall, in 1992 was absolutely essential to be able to feed people in Somalia, and was done at the insistence of President Bush. And Operation Restore Hope was a big success in feeding people. It just ended up changing its focus later on after his administration, and obviously causing more problems over the long term. Andrew asked me to include in my chapter a story about the World Food Program, because although it had been around since 1961, there had not been an American executive director, and Clayton Yeider recommended to Jim Baker, recommended to the president, that we should consider having an American executive director. And then ultimately the White House and the State Department worked in order to achieve that, and therefore I went to WFP. But again, the US government was there. Andrew was associate administrator, AID, as a matter of fact, and they were very creative. Andrew was amazingly not just supportive, but creative, for instance, in giving funding to create a vulnerability mapping system, which is greatly expanded and hugely helpful to this day, to map the areas that are the most food insecure, and therefore to be able to target the people that were most in need. And it's been used in practically every country which needs food assistance ever since then. And that's just one of many examples of the US leadership in the Bush administration in an effort to support not only current needs, but build systems for the future. And you know, every one of the initiatives that I mentioned had ongoing success stories afterwards. DHA becoming OCHA, becoming a major coordination, support for the BAM, the Vulnerability Mapping System, now becoming a key part of this whole attention to hungry people around the world. Then US was very supportive in the creation of logistics capacity, and now there's an airline called UNHAS, the UN Humanitarian Air Service, run by the World Food Program, which is the air service not only for movement of shipment of food and other goods, but also people, humanitarian air transport service all around the world. But that started also with generous creative ideas from the US government. So there were a lot of people working on these matters because they understood the bigger picture that the president wanted to achieve.
Catherine Bertini, what are some lessons for current policymakers or future policymakers?
Dan, one of them was said by Andy Card earlier when he talked about President Bush working in creating a climate of respect. And in the international community, there's no way we can be successful without being respectful of all of the people with whom we're working and all of the people whom we're trying to serve. So that's number one in terms of operations. And then I think the second point is that he and we should think about objectives we want to achieve over the long term. The short-term objectives only are not what's going to change the world, but the long-term objectives are. And just as some examples of this, for instance, in Ambassador Pickering's chapter, he talks about UN reform. It didn't happen during the time of George Bush, but the seeds were planted there through the work that Ambassador and others did. And then ultimately when Kofi Annan became Secretary General, they weren't new ideas, a lot of them, and in fact he did implement many of the things that came up through the Bush era. Another example is that when I talked about South Africa, what was done during apartheid with respect to reaching people who were in need of food was very helpful to build relationships that were then useful once apartheid fell, especially relationships between South Africa and the other countries. So the idea about women, also the one I mentioned about putting an ambassador level person in to promote more women in the system. Over the short term, maybe there wasn't as much success, but over the long term, the building blocks were there so that there are many, many, many more women now in the UN system, in part because of the push by the American government under George Herbert Walker Bush. So climate of respect and the long-term view and taking actions and decisions based on where our country wants to be or help the world to be over the long term are the two lessons I'd suggest.